From this section, we're going to start taking a look at what the EU Green Deal means for the ready-made garment sector. What are the sorts of things that companies within the ready-made garment sector will need to do if they want to continue selling into the EU? And remember that while the EU has always been a leader, it's very likely that other parts, how big the EU is as a market, and I guess another big market is China to some extent, but also the US. The US is a big export destination for Bangladeshi RMGs, and US is 330 million people or so. EU is more than 400 million. So it's very likely that in order to continue selling into those important markets, changes will have to be made. And so what are some of these changes? Well, the manufacturers will have to shift toward using sustainable and eco-friendly materials, such as organic cotton, as well as cotton that's not sourced from places where there are human rights violations. Will have to use more recycled fibers. So I think just being able to use some changes to your machinery or retooling, and then look at other low impact alternatives. They'll have to explore innovative materials that meet the EU standards for circularity and environmental performance. Remember, we spent quite a bit of time discussing what the minimum sustainability requirements will be relative to recyclability, reusability, repairability, origins, and that sort of thing. So effectively then, to sell into the EU, RMG manufacturers are going to have to make sure that their manufacturing process allows them to produce goods that continue to allow them to sell. So they have to one thing they'll have to do is adopt more sustainable materials. They will have to increase their level of transparency relative to their supply chain. That means they'll have to trace the origin of raw materials and ensure ethical practices throughout the production process, as we've alluded to a few times. And both of those countries have come under scrutiny in the recent past for human rights violations and or deforestation or displacement of populations. And those are all the sorts of things that are going to be, that's the kind of information that will be required to be contained in the digital passport. So how do you get around those things? Well, there's a lot of software that helps people keep track of that. So that software is expensive. In fact, someone in my family works for a company that sells software that does this kind of thing. Helps you, it's data analytics software. So that's a whole nother sort of expense and expertise that RMG guys are going to have to implement so that they can keep track of all this data relative to how they source, where the raw materials are sourced from, what sort of practices certain suppliers use. All that needs to be tracked so that it can be verified. That's a whole nother layer of sort of like infrastructure or reporting or IT capability that has to be implemented. The RMG guys are going to have to focus more on how their product is designed relative to its durability. Remember, we talked about fast fashion, how fast fashion has evolved, and it encourages people to buy and throw rather than reuse. That's a very unsustainable sort of behavior, right? It's not good for the environment. So what does it mean for the RMG sector? Well, the companies are going to have to collaborate together with designers, right? So somebody's designing the stuff to make sure that they're creating products that are durable, repairable, and reusable, rather than, for example, shirts that fall apart after wearing them 2 times. So what does that mean? That means that the manufacturers, RMG guys, may want to look at revamping their manufacturing process, right? Perhaps they can make it more modular so that they can plug and play, so that can be easily upgraded or repaired. But at the end of the day, what they need to do is prioritize longevity, so longer lasting products over fast fashion trends. And that's a big step away. Clearly, energy efficiency is very important. So I know that throughout the industry in Bangladesh already, many RMG manufacturers have upscaled their machinery or changed their machinery to machinery that's more energy efficient. There's basic things that you can do, such as change the types of motors on your sewing machine, or there's heat trapping mechanisms. But all of these things, they can't be changes if they haven't been implemented yet, and they all cost money. Basically, what the RMG industry needs to do is invest in energy efficient machinery and technologies, and to optimize their production processes to use as little energy as possible. And they may want to consider only buying electricity or power that is produced from renewable sources. How they manage their waste is important. I know that the RMG industry in Bangladesh has been through this to some extent for the last couple of years, because the ETP laws, so effluent treatment plants, have become mandatory in some cases. So there's been a lot of activity around implementing that as well. Local banks provide financing towards ETP implementation. But at the end of the day, the RMG sector will need to develop effective waste management systems and encourage more recycling or upcycling of textile waste. Remember, we spoke about the significant volumes of textiles that become waste in Bangladesh. Well, those can be reused relatively easily, but there's a cost associated with the reuse in terms of retooling, and also in terms of just the capability and know-how. So that's changes that will have to be implemented. In other parts of the world, the whole recycling thing has industries popping up, and even software and technology providers that help recyclers to become more efficient in the way they do it. So all that to say that, yes, waste management and recycling is going to become increasingly more important, and as such, RMG manufacturers will have to take a look at it and to some extent revamp the way they approach recycling. A quick pause again to see if there are any questions before we look at financing options.